Round barely makes it through. Clean, complete penetration where the round went through the armor. Maintained significant post-penetration energy, and would have absolutely devastated the crew compartment. The test was repeated multiple times with multiple impact points to ensure it wasn't an anomaly. The result was consistent. German ammunition was defeating American armor at ranges where the Abrams was supposed to be effectively immune to any ground-based threat. Hold on. Before you skip ahead thinking you know how this story ends, I need you to understand that what I'm about to reveal isn't just about one test or one weapon system. This is about a calculated experiment that was buried so deep and classified archives that even mentioning it could have ended military careers. And when fragments finally surfaced decades later through leaked documents and off-record testimonies, it threatened to unravel the entire narrative about NATO armor superiority during the Cold War's most dangerous years. In 1987, West German military officials took captured Soviet weapons, added their own Leopard to main battle tank ammunition to the mix, and systematically fired everything they had at American M1 Abrams tanks in a test that was never supposed to leave the facility. The question everyone wanted answered was simple. Did it work? Could German and Soviet anti-tank weapons defeat the armor that America claimed was revolutionary? The answer was so explosive, so politically devastating that the full results remain classified 38 years later. But through fragmented reports, procurement pattern analysis, and testimonies from people who were present, we can piece together what happened, and more importantly, why the defense establishment has spent nearly 4 decades making sure you never heard the complete story. Asterisk, let me establish the stakes first, because without understanding the geopolitical context, you can't appreciate why this test became so controversial. It's 1987 and the Cold War is approaching what nobody knew would be its final phase. NATO and the Warsaw Pact are staring at each other across the German border with thousands of tanks. And the prevailing assumption is that if World War III starts, it begins with Soviet armor pouring through the Fulda Gap trying to reach the Rhine before NATO can mobilize a response. The entire Western defensive strategy depends on NATO armor being qualitatively superior to Soviet armor. One Western tank needs to be able to defeat 2 or 3 Soviet tanks to offset the numerical advantage the Warsaw Pact enjoys. The M1 Abrams, which entered service in 1980, is the centerpiece of this strategy. American military officials are publicly claiming it's the most survivable tank ever built, with composite armor that makes it effectively immune to Soviet anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. Asterisk, but behind closed doors, European NATO members, particularly West Germany, are quietly skeptical. They're being asked to commit their defense budgets and their soldiers' lives to a strategy that assumes American armor superiority, but they don't have independent verification of the claims. All the testing data comes from American sources using American protocols. The Germans have their own tank, the Leopard 2, which they believe is equal or superior to the Abrams, and they have their own ammunition development programs that are producing some of the most advanced armor-piercing rounds in the world. So when the opportunity arose to conduct comparative testing, to actually fire real weapons at real Abrams armor under controlled conditions, German military intelligence jumped at it. Asterisk, the official justification for the test, the paperwork that allowed it to happen without immediately triggering a diplomatic crisis, was that NATO needed standardized data on armor protection across all member nations to ensure interoperability and effective combined operations. The unofficial justification, the one that people involved have hinted at in the decades since, was that Germany wanted proof. They wanted to know if American armor claims were legitimate or if they were procurement propaganda, and they wanted to know how their own weapons and ammunition compared to what the Soviets were fielding, because if war came, understanding the actual capabilities of all sides could mean the difference between effective defense and catastrophic defeat. Asterisk. The test took place at the Grafenwohr training area in Bavaria, at a facility that documents refer to only by the designation. Site 73 M1 Abrams tanks were provided by American forces stationed in Germany. These weren't special test vehicles or prototype armor packages. They were production line tanks with the same armor configuration that was being fielded to frontline units across NATO. The test protocol was designed by a joint German-American technical team, though based on what happened afterward, it's clear the Germans had more input into the actual execution than the Americans were comfortable with. Asterisk, phase 1 of the testing used captured and reverse-engineered Soviet weapons, the RPG-7 with various warhead types including the then-new tandem-shaped charge designed to defeat reactive armor, the 9 M113 Konkurs, known to NATO as the 85 Spandrel, a wire-guided anti-tank missile that was the Soviet equivalent of the American TOW, and most critically, 125mm ammunition from captured T-72 tanks, including the 3BM-42 Mango armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sub-0 round, which was the most advanced Soviet tank ammunition that Western intelligence knew about at the time. Asterisk, the RPG-27 testing produced results that were largely expected. Against frontal armor, no penetration was achieved even with the tandem warhead at close range. Against side and rear armor, Penetration was achieved at ranges under 200 meters, which was considered acceptable because doctrine called for tanks to never expose side armor to known threats. The Conqueror's missile achieved penetration of side armor and marginal penetration of frontal armor when hitting at optimal angles, which was concerning but not catastrophic because the missile's large-shaped charge warhead was specifically designed to defeat heavy armor. Then came the 125mm gun testing, and this is where the results started to diverge from what American officials were expecting. The 3BM-42 round, fired from a captured T-72 main gun at combat distances, achieved penetration of the Abrams frontal turret armor at 1200 meters. Not every shot, the penetration was probabilistic depending on exact impact, angle, and which specific part of the turret was hit, but the penetration rate was high enough to be tactically significant. At 800 meters, penetration was consistent. This was deeply troubling because NATO doctrine assumed that the Abrams had a standoff advantage, that it could engage Soviet tanks at 2000 meters where Soviet rounds couldn't penetrate, giving NATO forces the ability to destroy attackers before they could effectively return fire. But the test showed that Soviet penetrators could defeat Abrams' frontal armor at ranges well within what would be normal combat engagement distances in the terrain of Central Europe. If Soviet tanks could get within 1200 meters, which wouldn't be difficult in the forests and rolling hills of Germany, they had a legitimate chance of achieving kills against the Abrams. This meant the qualitative advantage that NATO was depending on was much smaller than advertised. The American observers at the test, according to second-hand accounts from people who were present, immediately started questioning the methodology. Was the armor sample defective? Were the Soviet rounds somehow more capable than intelligence assessments suggested? Were the impact angles unrealistic? The armor was inspected and found to be within specification. The ammunition was analyzed and matched known Soviet production standards. The test geometry was reviewed and found to be representative of realistic combat scenarios. The results stood. Soviet weapons could defeat American armor more effectively than the protection specifications suggested they should be able to. But here's where the test went from concerning to politically catastrophic. Phase 2 of the testing involved German weapons, specifically the main gun of the Leopard 2 firing 33 German Marks armor-piercing ammunition. The justification was comparative analysis, understanding how Allied ammunition performed relative to Soviet ammunition for logistics and interoperability planning. The reality was that Germany wanted to know how their ammunition stacked up against American armor, and they had the leverage to insist on including it in the test protocol. The Leopard 2 gun firing 33 German Marks achieved clean penetration of Abrams frontal turret armor at 2000 meters, not marginal penetration where the round barely makes it through. Clean, complete penetration where the round went through the armor, maintained significant post-penetration energy, and would have absolutely devastated the crew compartment. The test was repeated multiple times with multiple impact points to ensure it wasn't an anomaly. The result was consistent. German ammunition was defeating American armor at ranges where the Abrams was supposed to be effectively immune to any ground-based threat. The immediate reaction from the American delegation was shock, followed by what witnesses describe as barely controlled anger. This wasn't just an unexpected test result. This was a direct challenge to the entire procurement justification for the Abrams program. If Allied ammunition could penetrate the armor at 2000 meters, it meant that the protection specifications that Congress had been given, that NATO had been given, that soldiers had been given, were fundamentally wrong. Additional testing was demanded. The armor samples were examined for manufacturing defects. None were found. The ammunition was verified to match production specifications. It did. More shots were fired at different angles and different points on the turret. The penetration capability was confirmed. Then came the comparison that made everything exponentially worse from a political perspective. The test protocol called for American M829 armor-piercing rounds to be fired from an Abrams at a Leopard 2 that the Germans had provided for reciprocal testing. At 2000 meters, the American ammunition did not achieve penetration of the German armor. At 1500 meters, marginal penetration started to occur. At 1200 meters, consistent penetration was achieved. So the data showed that German ammunition could penetrate American armor at 2000 meters, but American ammunition needed to get within 1200 meters to penetrate German armor. Not stored, not mothballed, not even used for additional testing. Destroyed. When you destroy million-dollar assets instead of preserving them for analysis, it's because there's something about them you don't want anyone examining too closely. Within months, everything about American tank armor development changed in ways that only make sense if you understand them as responses to what the German test revealed. The official explanation was that new materials were available that could enhance protection. The timing and the specific nature of the changes tell a different story. The redesigned armor incorporated depleted uranium mesh layers that weren't in the original M1 specification. Depleted uranium is extraordinarily dense, extremely effective against kinetic penetrators, expensive to manufacture, and controversial because of health and environmental concerns. You do want to add depleted uranium unless you have a very compelling reason to believe your existing armor is inadequate. The protection improvements from the depleted uranium package were dramatic according to later testing. The M1A1 heavy armor variant that incorporated it showed substantially better resistance to penetration. American sources claim it can defeat all known kinetic penetrators at ranges beyond 2,000 meters. But notice the pattern. Test reveals vulnerability. Armor gets upgraded. New testing shows improved performance. That's exactly what you'd expect if the original armor was inadequate and the upgrade fixed a real problem that could be publicly acknowledged. At the same time, there was a sudden diplomatic push within NATO for standardized armor testing protocols. A working group was established, chaired by American representatives, to develop common standards for evaluating protection across all NATO members. The resulting standards, conveniently, emphasized different metrics than the ones that had revealed the Abrams vulnerability. The new protocols focused heavily on protection against Soviet ammunition, where the Abrams performed adequately even if not spectacularly, and de-emphasized comparative testing between NATO allies, which had produced the embarrassing results. This wasn't an accident. This was bureaucratic maneuvering to ensure that future testing wouldn't generate data that contradicted the official narrative. The German response was equally telling in what it revealed about how seriously they took the test results. Publicly, Germany continued to express complete confidence in NATO interoperability and the effectiveness of Allied armor. Privately, their procurement decisions told a different story. The Leopard 2 production run was extended beyond original plans. Upgrade programs were accelerated and expanded. Most significantly, Germany became much more assertive in demanding input into any joint NATO armor development programs, effectively using their knowledge of comparative armor performance as leverage in coalition negotiations. Now let's address the question that's at the heart of this entire investigation. Did German anti-tank fire work against American armor? The answer is unambiguously yes. German ammunition defeated American armor at ranges where American doctrine assumed the armor was safe. But that simple answer leads to much more complicated questions that the defense establishment has spent nearly 4 decades avoiding. If German ammunition, which was comparable to Soviet ammunition in most technical specifications, could penetrate at 2,000 meters, what did that mean for actual Soviet capabilities? The 3BM42 Mango round that the Soviets were fielding had similar penetrator design, similar velocities, similar sectional density to the German 33 German Marks. If 33 German Marks could penetrate at 2,000 meters, there was no reason to believe Mango couldn't do the same. This meant that the protection advantage that justified the Abrams procurement, that underwrote NATO defensive strategy, that soldiers depended on, was based on testing that had significantly overestimated armor effectiveness. The armor wasn't defective in the sense of having manufacturing flaws. It performed exactly as designed. But the design was based on threat assessments and testing protocols that turned out to be optimistic to the point of being dangerous. Here's what should terrify anyone who cares about honest defense procurement. The same organizations that conducted the testing that missed this vulnerability are conducting testing on current armor systems. The M1A2, CPV-3, the latest Abrams variant, is claimed to have protection that makes it immune to all current threats. That claim is based on testing by the same entities using evolved versions of the same protocols that produced overly optimistic results in the 1980s. How confident should we be that current testing isn't missing vulnerabilities that independent testing would reveal? The honest answer is we shouldn't be confident at all. And that lack of confidence isn't defeatism, it's basic risk assessment. There's also a broader lesson here about how military institutions handle uncomfortable data. The 1987 test produced results that threatened major programs and contradicted official claims. The institutional response was to classify the results, restrict access to the data, upgrade the armor quietly without public explanation, and ensure that future testing was structured to avoid generating similarly problematic results. At no point was there public accountability, congressional oversight of the actual test findings, or transparent reassessment of whether armor specifications had been misrepresented. The problem was managed bureaucratically, not addressed honestly. This pattern repeats throughout defense procurement history. Testing reveals a problem. The problem gets classified. Equipment gets quietly upgraded. New testing using friendlier protocols shows the upgrade works. The original problem is never publicly acknowledged. The people who depended on the faulty equipment never find out that what they trusted their lives to didn't work as advertised. And most importantly, there's no institutional learning about why the original testing was inadequate, which means the same mistakes get repeated with new systems. Let me walk through what the 1987 test should have triggered but didn't. First, immediate public disclosure to Congress and NATO that protection specifications had been based on inadequate testing. Second, retrofit programs to upgrade armor on fielded vehicles, not just new production. Third, complete revision of armor testing protocols to include independent testing by allies and testing against actual threat ammunition obtained through intelligence. Fourth, investigation into how the original testing failed to identify the vulnerability and what systemic changes were needed to prevent similar failures. Fifth, transparent reporting so that soldiers knew the actual capabilities and limitations of their equipment. None of that happened. What happened instead was classification. Quiet upgrades for new production vehicles while existing vehicles stayed in service with inadequate armor. Cosmetic changes to testing protocols that didn't address fundamental issues. No investigation of testing failures, and continued public claims that the armor worked as originally specified. The soldiers who depended on that armor in Desert Storm in 1991 were lucky that Iraqi tactics were poor and engagement ranges favored NATO forces, because if they'd faced competent opponents using the ammunition that the 1987 test evaluated, the results could have been very different. So did German anti-tank fire work against American armor? Yes, it worked better than it was supposed to, better than American testing suggested it would, and well enough to reveal that armor protection claims were fundamentally unreliable. The defense establishment's response to this revelation tells you everything you need to know about whether the priority is honest assessment or program protection. The test was buried, the data was classified, the armor was upgraded without explanation, and the narrative of American armor superiority continued unchanged. 38 years later, we're still fielding armor based on claims that we have good reason to believe. Maybe overly optimistic, tested by the same organizations that missed the vulnerability the first time with no independent verification and no transparency. The 1987 test should have been a wake-up call about the dangers of optimistic testing and the need for honest assessment. Instead, it became a case study in how uncomfortable truths get buried when they threaten established programs. The question isn't whether German fire worked against American armor. The question is whether we've learned anything from discovering that it did, or whether we're just going to keep making the same mistakes with higher stakes and more expensive equipment until we find out the hard way, again, that our armor doesn't actually do what we've been told it does. Cloud